Welcome to this edition of Diligence Inside Europe's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter and I will be your host for today's show. This is actually part two of my visit with David Tyler, who's the chairman of Hammerson and also the chairman of Domestic and General Group. And in the last show, we discussed some governance issues and issues with sort of long-term and short-term sustainability. And on this show, we're going to talk a little bit about diversity, David, if that's okay.
You're welcome.
So obviously it's diversity in the boardroom and in the management C-suite is issues all over the globe. Society, investors have made sure that that's an issue, particularly the gender. We've seen a lot of publicity on. The UK, in fact, has done a pretty good job with gender without any quotas or really regulation, just setting targets, which is good. But let's start by why is, in your mind and in the public's mind, is diversity on boards particularly so important?
Well, let's take it from the point of view of a company. I'm a company chairman. I want to make sure, first of all, that I get access to 100% of the brains and ability of the people who live in the relevant country, in this case, the UK. And if I'm not making sure that 50% of the people here who are women are not properly represented on my board, I'm almost certainly missing out on some of the capabilities and talents that are there. Ditto with ethnic minorities. We have about 13–14% of the people in the UK today who come from ethnic minorities. And if I'm not typically taking account and addressing the opportunity of bringing those people in, I think I'm missing out on their brain power and ability. So that's number one. Performance of the company will be better if you make sure you've got access to everybody. The second thing is the concern which you've seen over the years in many companies where there is some sort of failure because of too much groupthink. Too many people, typically white, or we say male, stale and pale, I'm sure you've heard the expression before, sitting around the same board table with similar kinds of backgrounds who don't get it from the point of view of many other people. I think if you want to avoid groupthink, having people who come from a very different background, different ages, different countries, different education experiences and so on, is going to enable you to think better about the issues in front of you. And I also think time and again to myself, if I want to sell as a business to the whole community, which is made up, of course, of every ethnic community, obviously every gender, people with different other diverse backgrounds. I need to be thinking about all of those effectively by having people in my team who have had those experiences and are thinking about that too. So all of this means, I think, you're doing two things by having a diverse board and diverse management and indeed senior management team. You're doing two things. One, you're improving the performance of your company because of that wider range of thinking. And there's quite a number of studies which tend to enhance and underline the success of more diverse companies. But in addition, I've always felt that companies had a wider purpose than just profit, and the social purpose here is important. You want to be, as far as I'm concerned, an organisation that addresses fairness and justice issues. And if you are not open to every part, every walk of society, people from every point of view and diversity, I think you're not addressing that issue, which I think is front and centre of us as human beings to operate a company that operates in that social justice agenda appropriately. So a long answer, but I hope that helps the background for you.
So I want to make sure that when we mention diversity, gender is getting most of that attention these days. It can be measured.
Sure.
It's really on the front end. But when we talk about diversity on a board, we're talking about the ethnic or racial diversity. We're talking about age. We're talking about skill sets. We're talking about geographic location potentially. All those things, or even diversity of thought, of where somebody comes from. So those are all factors that as a chairman or the head of a nominating committee, have to give thought to as they're planning, out that side of it. But the ethnic or racial is particularly hard to measure. I know in the States, the largest ethnic community is Hispanic, and Hispanics are very poorly represented on boards. It's a real challenge for them. So as a chairman, when you look at all of those diversity categories, and particularly age, because with digital transformation and disruption, cyber, all those issues which lend themselves to younger directors, all of a sudden you're looking at people in their late 30s, 40s, as candidates on the board. So as chairman, how do you think that through? What do you say to your board? What do you say to management about the issue of diversity?
Well, you think about it very carefully, and you know you can never have perfection here. And of course, you need a lot of those characteristics of older, more experienced individuals who've been through many issues in the past. Maybe an acquisition that succeeded or failed, maybe a change of chief executive that succeeded or failed. So I think as your core members of your board, I'm very clear you need a few wise grey heads. Doesn't mean they have to be that old, but certainly as a core of experience, I think it helps the executives to have people who can say, what happened when you did this or that and the other? But in addition to that, if you haven't got a very clear view about our fast changing society, technology above all and digital and so on, if that's not represented in the boardroom, I think there's a danger that you make mistakes. If you haven't got people who are culturally aware of what's going on in our society, how choices and trends are affecting demands for your products and services, there is a danger that those old grey heads may be very good at those sorts of issues I've just talked about, but not very aware of how society is changing. So in a fast changing world, this diversity, I think, today is more important. It's across this range that you talked about, and I'm sure, as you say, in the States, in ethnic diversity, that Latino issue is important. Here, for example, we have an issue with ethnic diversity. Although we have in the FTSE 100, I know all the statistics here quite well because I co-chair a government-sponsored review on this issue of ethnic diversity in big boards. Although we have about 6 or 7% of the total FTSE 100 board membership coming from an ethnic diverse background, around 4 or 5% of those actually come from other countries, because the particular company may be focused in Africa or South America or such like, or Asia, where there are people from that background who naturally end up on your boards. If we look at the number who actually were born in the UK and come from an ethnic background, ethnic diverse background, that's less than 2%, and that's not good enough. And what we're trying to do in this particular committee in the UK is grow that over a period of time so that at least one member of the ethnic minority communities is on every FTSE 100 board. And that's the target we've set ourselves. We're not proposing that's mandatory. We don't think that's the right approach, but we do think targets have a big impact. And as you said earlier, with the women agenda, that's worked very effectively. We're up to about 30% now in the FTSE 100.
Would you expect, when you look at Europe countries as a whole, would you expect that those countries that don't set targets and that don't manage that themselves, that investors will be successful in getting regulations or quotas or mandates for that? It just seems like a sign of the times, and if you're not going to do it yourself, you can expect to have that.
I think these things are seen as really important by many investors today for exactly the reasons I think I've articulated. It actually improves company performance over a period of time in the views of many investors that I talk to. And so I think where they are active in maybe countries that don't have these targets or regulatory mandatory minimums, they can have an effective impact on the agenda. So I think it makes sense for big institutions to make their views known if that's what their views are.
Well, those are all terrific things for companies and boards to be thinking about, and I wanted to thank you, David, for taking the time to join me. And that will conclude this episode of Inside Europe's Boardrooms. We want to thank you for joining us. We'll be looking at other critical topics in the future that'll help you be a better board member or committee member, so we'll see you then.